Chapter 34. Petrov's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits as a voice slid down the line. Ivan, we agreed to hold off, maintain focus. A fix should be the priority. This will cause distraction and... We're confident you can maintain Don's focus, came the firm response down the line. Petrov's jaw firmed. It was unhelpful to say the least, but the low instruction was persistent. I trust you'll take care of it. Xander's signed off on this? You have till the end of the week. With that, the line went dead. Rage flickered across Petrov's face, fist tightening around the phone. It was a power play, no doubt about it. The rest of the family could smell blood in the water. Order had to be restored before the fools tore the entire syndicate apart, divided themselves to the point of insignificance. Easily done now, given Velda's timely alliance and possession of the ledger. If he could just get to Xander, convince him to abstain until after he'd cleaned up this mess, he could perhaps save Ivan and prevent internal fractures weakening them further. Their timing couldn't be worse. His phone bleeped with the coordinates for the mercenaries' trace. It was a step closer. His gaze shuddered, giving it some thought before forwarding on the location to his boys. See what you find. Right now, he had to get to Xander. Asterisk. In their small London basement, beneath the troubles and craziness of the world, Grace could see Alessandro pull himself out of bed, only to smile back at Annika. I'll make time later, promise. He grabbed his laptop as Annika gave a whimsical smile, hoping it hid her wounded pride that bled out. The idea of being someone's chore on a never-ending list was a challenging dynamic to spin, even for her wildly romantic imagination. He was right, of course, she mused, picking at her nails. They had lots to do, lots of important, technical things to focus on. Only she didn't want to focus on the technical or keep trying to control everything, fix everything. It was exhausting. She just wanted to go back to the beginning, to normality. Lord, how the memory of normality seemed heavenly. When things were simple, a sigh escaped as she eyed her pillow somewhat enviously. That pillow seemed the only way back, a doorway reanimating the past and allowing her to explore new worlds. Ones less complicated, or at least ones that were messed up in the right sort of way. But as things were, she'd rather be asleep. Are you okay? Alessandro turned from where he slid his laptop away, watching as she gave a quiet nod. Did you get through to Kubi? He'll be at De La Reve. Of all the things to survive the troubles, brothels. Annika's mouth twisted disapprovingly. I'll warn him when he gets in. Now isn't the time to be taking chances. Not if Petrov really is back in town. Men. She'd never had a one-night stand, let alone been able to imagine herself with a complete stranger you paid to. Well, it just seemed wrong, on every level. Alessandro sobered. Not all of us are like that. His mouth firmed. Even if we're never around. Her fingers ran through his hair as he bent to kiss her goodbye. Won't be long. I'll tell Velda you say hi. Annika pulled a face. Don't wind her up so early. With that, the door swung shut, and Annika stared at the foot of her broken bed where it overlooked the rest of the dilapidated studio. Her incredibly high-functioning twin running through her head like a regular Natasha Romanoff. And living proof that exercise doesn't make you happy, she surmised with a firm, silent nod before eyeing her own skinny frame. Both Velda and exercise simply made everything else seem easier in comparison. Flipping her laptop closed, she noticed Alessandro had left his phone. He'd be back for it later, no doubt. Rolling out of bed, she threw on an oversized jumper, even though she'd brought Velda together with Alessandro's team and handed them the alliance with the SMC, exposing Petrov's Achilles heel. Velda kept her at arm's length, her mouth scrunched aside, recalling the look her sister gave when they crossed paths, like eyeing a grenade. She winced. Velda had managed to forgive Alessandro. So why not her? She pottered through to the kitchenette, which consisted of 2 cupboards, a rusted tap, and a travel kettle, where she poured herself some Pro-Neutrino before chipping away at the rock of coffee at the bottom of an old tin. Pro-Neutrino was all there was to eat, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The gray powder meals were tasteless but nutritious and filling. Annika picked up a cup and scowled at her hand where it trembled. Blasted thing. She shook it out. It did that from time to time, since she was about 11. With her other hand to steady the cup, she sipped at the warm coffee, and her thoughts drifted off on the exotic aroma before returning to Inter. Since their alliance with the SMC, they'd managed to set up decentralized bases across the city. Things had gone from strength to strength. They still hadn't managed to hack the ledger, but Alessandro now shared her view that it was likely something of great importance, especially as rumors surfaced that Petrov himself had returned to London. Annika had been heading up PR and propaganda for some time at Inter. It was all right, though she suspected Velda assigned her the role to keep her out of the way. Stirring water into gray powder, her thoughts flitted back to their campaign slogan. Inter, built by the people, for the... But her thoughts cut out as an almighty thud shook the front door. Inching back toward the bathroom, elbow knocking over the box of proneutrino, she saw the door fly off its hinges where it gave way to a giant of a man, face bruised and bloodied, closely followed by another. Breakfast clattering to the floor, she dashed to the bathroom, flicking a slim barrel bolt across and toppling a storage unit to wedge it shut. It was just as well as the bolt bent and buckled where they rammed the door. Popping open the narrow basement window, she scrambled up, hearing the door give way as she slid out onto the dusty sidewalk, only to be yanked off her feet. Skinny frame dangling in the air, she glared back at the second giant who must have double-backed. His breath blew back her red curls. "Velda!" he boomed, somewhat triumphantly. She couldn't help the laugh that escaped. "You're the first to make that mistake. But before she could finish, pain sliced into the back of her neck and everything began to blur. Asterisk. Grace woke with a jolt as her bedroom door crashed open. Dreams of Annika's abduction dispersed as she stared up at Mum's hellish expression. She was standing in the doorway, lit by Hydra's sunset that spilt crimson shades over her. She was no longer curled up on the floor beside her wardrobe where she'd hid after Mum chased her upstairs. When had she moved? She glanced at the clock and felt color drain from her face. Almost no time had passed. Her mind burned, trying to piece together threads from where she'd left off. Before her dream, before Annika's abduction, or Velda and the SMC's alliance. The disparity in time dizzying, she felt nauseous. Mum had been angry, she realized, gaze flicking to Mum's hands, relieved to see she wasn't holding the knife. "Grace," Mum's expression softened. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she insisted, though she knew she wasn't. Even her bedroom felt strangely unfamiliar. Inside, she felt detached, out of alignment, out of sorts. Though there was little time to dwell on it, as true to form, Mum returned to topic. "You're just like your father." Grace felt herself slip into autopilot. Whenever Mum was like this, it was best to say as little as possible. "Running away, locking me out. That arsehole will listen to all those he works with, spend hours with them, and those damn reports. But will he talk to me? No." Mum took a seat beside her. "You refuse to communicate about anything meaningful or important. It's not healthy." Her eyes locked on, as though searching for something, and Grace knew exactly what. Approval. She reflected that as best she could. "Sorry for my cards on the table approach. I know it's not fitting in this British culture. Even now, after the Troubles, one is still meant to only say and do what a person wants to hear, not anything of any real substance. At times, I think we are close to digesting answers, you and I. But then you behave just like your father. You run off, refuse to talk, and cause all this drama." Chapter 35. Mum sat, arms firmly locked beside her, as Grace continued filing away dreams of Velda King and Annika. Though her headache had eased, she still felt jet-lagged, horrifyingly foreign in her own body. It seemed surreal, not least because of the overwhelming sense of déjà vu. It didn't help that these encounters with Mum were frequent. Perhaps that was it. Grace felt herself slipping into survival mode. Growing up with Mum had made her extremely good at reading people. At times, to her, it felt like a superpower, like reading minds. "I know your father has poisoned your mind against me. I don't blame you for that." Mum reached for Grace's hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze, continuing on about how toxic Dad was, how Grace was just like him. The importance of not being like Dad, of not being herself, but also being genuine. How awful it is that people pretend to be something they're not. These conflicting messages had tied her in knots many times, tumbling about in her young mind, until 87 volunteered the translation. "Agree with me, share all my beliefs, Hold everything I say and do in high regard. Expect nothing in return, and then, at times when I need you, we can be friends." Mum was still talking, having moved on to praise an old Spanish lady she recently met, and the stark contrast between her and Grace. "She's such a passionate lady, gentle, calm, and always respectful. We have so much in common. She agrees with me on everything. There are no exceptions or pretenses with her." Nothing about these discussions got easier. The worst part about them was the wait. Would the monologue erupt in rage or settle her down? Had her efforts been enough this time? Every muscle ached, watching, waiting as minutes ticked by in this crescendo of suspense. "I'm so glad we had this chat. I feel we're making real progress, you and I," Mum finally breathed, giving her hand another tight squeeze. "Resnick and Dad will be back soon," she muttered, hovering at the door a moment before flashing a tight smile. "I won't breathe a word of this to them. Wouldn't want to ruin your birthday weekend. What a lovely time of year for one." Grace watched as the door closed. As far as birthdays went, it could be worse. She winced, mind washing back over previous years. There was the bike ride, which Mum insisted crossed the suspension bridge. Despite Grace's crippling fear of heights and blustery conditions, that was the last time Grace invited a friend over to share the experience. She'd been 9 years old. Then there was the trophy mount. Mum had the best of intentions, had it put up in her bedroom as a birthday surprise for their young animal lover. "Isn't it wonderful?" She could still see Mum beaming from ear to ear, where she admired the poor deer. Its skull and antlers hung there, like some unfortunate victim of Vlad the Impaler. "I knew you'd love it. You love animals." Grace did her best to smile. Mum hadn't the ability to process disappointment or handle frustration, so there it remained, the price of peace hanging over her bed. Scooping up a change of clothes, she hurried into the shower before Mum could return for one of her many one more things. Some 30 minutes later, hair wrapped in a towel, Grace wafted out the bathroom to the sound of chatter downstairs, the scent of vanilla and strawberries perfuming daydreams as she pottered back to her room, only for thunderous footsteps to follow her up. Brilliant green eyes flashed to the broken board, no longer able to bar entry, as Mum rounded the top few steps that spiraled and slung a bag of moldy sandwiches at her. "Mrs. Rose!" She staggered, breathless, furious. "Her Roblox!" is all she could manage, leering at the bag. To Grace, it resembled more of a mycologist specimen. "Answer me, damn it! They're moldy." "Nonsense, I scraped that off." Grace eyed the dusty blue mountains, wondering just how much had initially been on there as she put it down on the sideboard. "That? My goodness, you're fussy." Mum's arm shot out, handing it back, insisting Grace have it. "I don't want it." "You will have it, you hear me. It'll be your breakfast, lunch, and dinner until it's eaten. Do you understand?" Asterisk. 87 showered off back in his quarters. He'd come to enjoy their physical assessments, finding them as exhilarating as they were painful. Not only did they refine his already impressive skill set, they reacquainted him with his weaknesses and exposed others. His thoughts returned as they inevitably did to Grace in the source code. How was she doing it? Slipping outside of his reach in Mobius? It seemed unlikely the girl had conscious control over it, or him for that matter, but there was no denying the fact she could access areas he could not. Worse still, she got him to access areas he otherwise would not. It would have been easy to deal with her had she been like everyone else, but she actually seemed to care. Not just about him, but everything. Turning off the shower, his thoughts stuck on her situation at home, listening in on her mother's threat, forcing back the protective urge that it gave rise to. He did his best to ignore it. It had to be part of Morgan's safety mechanism. Toweling off, he slid on a pair of slacks. He needed distraction, time to get back to his old self. 20 minutes later, he took a seat in the assessment center, where other samples pretended to study the array of complex digital code and puzzles which project from where they sat. 87, however, seemed to prefer studying their blonde examiner's narrow waist. She was wrapped up in a provocative power suit, and there was something incredibly satisfying in knowing he'd help her out of it soon enough, though the idea clashed somewhat with the glare she currently threw back. The others had moved into Mobius, in effect pausing the exam, where they gathered, waiting for him, to discuss how best to proceed. Reluctantly, he washed in through familiar metaphysical doors and hovered there a moment. Most samples now shared the opinion that modern man were a closer representative of Neanderthals, having labeled themselves rather optimistically. They certainly aren't in a position to lead, 106 continued her usual rhetoric, backed by her usual handful of impatient samples. The rest remained silent, waiting to hear what 87 had to add. He'd always been a strong advocate of following Velda King's initiative, pushing integration with humans, and a slow rising to the top of the best candidates. Samples. A peaceful transfer of power to those better equipped to handle it, those who combined the best of AI and human interests. But those who agreed with 106 had become increasingly impatient of late, no thanks to the abuse they continued to suffer under their handlers at Inter and Sample's ability to view their intentions using Mobius. They were treated as lab rats, tools, a means to an end. These humans utilizing the inhumane in the name of humanity, leeching humanity from life, leeching life from Sample's veins in their attempt to prolong their own. It had been clear for some time now that these humans, organics, were looking for ways to restrict Samples to maintain control. We could take Inter by force. I see no reason to wait. We should be ruling, not serving these ingrates. 106 sneered. And follow in the footsteps of every empire before us? 87 joined the gathering beside 106. That's not what Velda would want. Her eyes narrowed on him, knowing he'd somehow managed to censor Mobius. She wasn't sure how he'd done it, just that he was up to something. Every inch of her screamed it. Velda might have created us, but she's one of them. Her attention turned to the many samples watching. We are superior. Compared to them, we are gods. After all they've done to us, it's unreasonable to suggest we wait longer. Even if Velda's intentions were noble, theirs sure as hell aren't. It's time they get their just desserts. It's time we take our place to step up and lead. That much is obvious. 87 gave a curt nod. It's obvious you have enough rope to hang us all. You say we're gods, but behave just like them. Worse, in fact, since you know better, but choose to follow in their footsteps, in circles, as lost as they are. We have Mobius. We will never be lost. We step outside of time, where nothing is unseen. 87 laughed, much to her annoyance. All while trapped in a worldly mindset, you'll find there's still much unseen. 87 mocked, though the uncomfortable truth of it irritated him. You've allowed yourself to become a slave to their standards, chained by the ideology of those who can't see all that is there. He spoke more to himself than his audience, beaten by their measuring stick. You're the one wanting us to serve them. Become slaves to them. 106 glared up at his infuriating grin, but he continued. Your plan is one of a slave. Your words, those of a fool. Given all you've seen in Mobius, you should know by now that when state of mind matters, matter does not. It's a mistake to get distracted, caught up collecting it. You're building your own cage. He gestured to Mobius, to her mind, as 106 cut him off. There's nothing wrong with having it all. We're better than them. We can do better. Not if you're trapped in their mindset. Mobius proves there are things that matter, more than matter itself. Things that translate from that world to this, things that last. 87 gazed about the living, breathing tapestry, still unsure as to what exactly it all meant. Their world of matter doesn't last. We know that. But this, seems to me, you're on their side. 106 snapped. If we have greater knowledge and tools at our disposal, and yet do nothing but tighten the cycle of entropy, shorten periods of peace between transfers of power. If we know there is something greater, and yet focus on the trivial and finite, aren't we the greater fools? 106's arms pulled tightly around her metaphysical form that resembled much of herself. There's nothing wrong with having it all, said the addict to their scales. 87 looked to the others. You have to ask yourself, at what cost? To yourself? To others? To the things that last? You've got to crack a few eggs. Her words ground out, hollow in sound. Old sayings doom us to old habits and older outcomes. Ask yourself, is that what you want? To be like them? Repeat all their mistakes? To share in old failures that have been done to death? 'Cause congratulations, that's your prize. Should be asking you that. An icy smile cracked across 106's face. You've changed. We've all noticed. She gestured to the other samples, keen to shift focus. No one else has the balls to call you out on it, but I will. 87's brow rose. Their audience, samples, seemingly having lost their voice. You've gone soft, 87 laughed. Then you've lost your touch, 106. With that, his attention shifted back to where he sat at enter, allowing the pretty drawl of their examiner to flood into Mobius. Asterisk. 87? The examiner's drawl pulled him from Mobius. I understand you had a good run this morning. I did. 87 smiled, admiring her soft pink lips, much to 106's annoyance. Shame to end it there. As you well know, there are no points for providing your ID. Her brow furrowed as she noticed he hadn't even completed that. I was distracted, he conceded with a wry smile. By? Her soft brown eyes narrowed as he declined to answer. Without your number on it, I can't assign you a score. A sardonic smile grew across 87's face as he activated his projected headset and began filling out the form. His fingers flew over projected keys, typing answers to questions he hadn't appeared to read. On text, she never saw him open, only for the program to return a perfect score moments later. Her brow pinched as results scrolled up and hovered in front of them. It was impossible. There had to be a glitch, a loophole he was exploiting somehow. But pulling up the base code and running diagnostics found nothing. Extraordinary, she breathed, glancing between 87 and his results before casting a glance over the rest of the room, which, although they weren't looking, seemed to be paying very close attention. Absolutely extraordinary. Chapter 36. Shortly after the examination, 87 could feel Hobbs searching for him. Dipping into Mobius revealed pressing issues. Hobbs' informant, Nash, had found out about 87's link to the source code and flagged it up. With a groan, 87 caught the stack of paper that was about to fall off the shelf onto his examiner, who moved with dedication, reviewing every inch of him as Hobbs stormed from one training room to another, finally stopping to pull up 87's citizen passport and locating his tracker. 87 supposed reluctantly it was time for the two of them to finish up. Moments later, Hobbs wrenched open the stationery cupboard to find 87 with their young examiner, who scrambled to pull her skirt back into place. Sir, it's... She struggled, attempting to iron out appearances. Finished, Hobbs barked, sending her hurrying off as he turned barely contained rage on 87. What the hell do you think you're playing at sample? Timetable has you in combat. You said to work on my people skills, he explained with a grin. This is not what I meant. Just using my initiative, sir. Don't. Hobbs' eyes narrowed on him. From now on, you follow every spoken and unspoken instruction to the letter. Do you hear? 87 gave a firm nod as to Hobbs' annoyance. A handsome smile only grew on the lad's face. My office, now. But 87 made no effort to move. On the contrary, he stood very, very still. There a problem, Sample? He watched as 87 gestured robotically toward the door. Ignoring initiative, sir. Following every spoken and unspoken instruction, sir. Hobbs eyed the lad as if he were perhaps broken. We are standing in a stationary cupboard, sir. 87 elaborate with a wide grin. Move! Asterisk. Inside Hobbs's office, 87 watched him fall into a large Chesterfield. He knew the guy both hated and revered Samples. 87 more than most. Couldn't stand the inferior feeling they left him with. Most of all, 87 could see Hobbs's hate the fact he needed them, felt his dependence grow daily. Since the day they were born, Hobbs had viewed them as tools to be used as required, to enhance and strengthen his position at Inter. Although 87 pushed the limits more often than not, he had also taken the time to study Hobbs and emulate parts of him. It made for a rather unusual dynamic between the two. Though he saw 87 as a threat, Hobbs also saw him as something of an extension to himself. He found him both highly vexing and venerating. Any idea how hard it is to get good trainers at this level? Hobbs barked, forcing himself back in his seat with a loud clunk, the position looking far less comfortable by the second. Stop messing about with them. He struggled with the chair. Damn it! 87 smiled from his stance across the room. Hobbs, he had noticed, had a useful habit, employing young women between 20 to 30 years of age. Smart, incredibly beautiful, and more importantly, far out of Hobbs' league. I handle them with care, sir. Hobbs leant to wrench the lever beneath his seat, sending the backrest crashing forward, propelling him into the desk. I need them impartial, indiscriminate. He glared at 87. And I'm very happy to rub off on them, sir. That's not what I meant. Hobbs snapped again, managing at last to recline the chair. I've top marks across the board. Hobbs cut him off, eager to get back to task as he reviewed 87's file. Look, there's a job I need you on. I need you focused, able to pick up on smaller details others have missed. Think you can manage that? Well, it's not technically a job if you don't pay us, 87 volunteered. Rest assured, you're worth every penny. Hobbs added with wicked amusement. I've been unable to track down the source code. He rubbed his brow, thoughts flickering back to his recent discussion with the head of Harrow. I've a feeling you're up to the task. We need that damn key, our source code. 87 felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He knew Hobbs had been looking for it at the school. The man's desperation was now as palpable as his confidence that 87 could deliver it. Nash. 87 could see the little rat's discussion with Hobbs play out after his chat with Alex on the roof. He'd been careless, distracted. His thoughts moved back to Grace. Their source code was the one thing 87 knew of with the potential to free or destroy them. Your future depends on it, son, threat-laced Hobbs' tone. I'll be damned if I let it fall into the wrong hands. Morrigan can't know we're looking, or she may well destroy it. 87 could see this was a test of loyalty as much as it was born from Hobbs' desperation. He clearly suspected Morrigan had hidden the source code at the school with one of the professors, but his trip turned up nothing. Morrigan works for you, 87 mused, posturing a little. You could force her hand. We have ways. He offered half-heartedly, already knowing the stupidity of that. Or I could handle her. He finished with a suggestive smile. You don't have the right equipment. I've never had complaints. Breasts, you don't have them. No, 87 seemed to give the matter quite some thought. But I could get my hands on a pair, he drawled with a knowing smile. Morrigan insists the source code was misplaced or destroyed by Inter during our seizure of samples. She catches wind that we're looking, that we don't believe her. It'll disappear for good. His eyes narrowed on 87. We can't have that happen. National security, your own security, depends on it. 87 wasn't about to let that happen. No one would lay a hand on Grace without his say-so. Why keep Morrigan here if she's withholding vital information, he continued, muddling through the necessary diversions he could throw Hobbs's way. Protocol means you could have Morrigan struck off, even imprisoned, unable to destroy it. That assumes she's working alone, that it isn't destroyed if she doesn't check in once in a while. I can't take that chance. Keep your enemies close, especially the smart ones. His eyes bore into 87. How do you suggest we proceed? There was little 87 hated more than downplaying his intellect. But if he learned anything through centuries of adventures in Mobius, it was the easy advantage given to those who undersold their intellect. Besides, their underestimation afforded him time for more pleasurable activities, something which, even though having slipped in priority of late, was something he didn't care to give up. Keep your eyes and ears open round Morrigan, feed back anything of note, and take a look through these. Hobbs handed over Morrigan's files on an old data chip, the original he assumed. Throwing back a curt nod, 87 took his leave. Inside the West Wing at Inter HQ, seal-locked doors hissed behind 87 as he strode through his apartment. Sliding Hobbs' chip into a replicator before selecting an original file format, he watched as the intricate glass-housed machine used a combination of smart material and 3D printing to fabricate the files. It had become one of his favorite gadgets. Many had lost interest in tangible items and opted for a minimalist apartment here at Inter. That had its perks, but 87 much preferred the feel of organic material between his fingers, malleable and responsive to touch, as opposed to the ghostly holograms that haunted the spaces in which most of them lived. He'd furnished his with books, Parisian rugs, replicas of old African masks and Akkadian relics. It was a sleek, modern room with ornate furnishings, overlooking the waterfalls of the First. A golden cage, 87 mused, fully aware of what Hobbs and their keepers had achieved here at Inter. Years of litmus tests had proved samples' superhuman ability while instilling a sense of nostalgia toward hierarchy and role, to which they had become not only accustomed, but drawn to. Watching smart material cells in the replicator bleed together and coalesce, he pulled out the paper file it birthed. Striding to the couch, his thoughts drew to Grace. Things were surprisingly quiet in her room, though he could hear her imagination whirl away. It wasn't that he worried about others finding her. He'd solved that problem years ago and taken great pains to keep her hidden. He remembered it as though yesterday, Grace's gentle voice as direct as it was now. Chapter 37. Closing his eyes, he was right back there, all those years ago, the scent of coconut and red curls that lay strewn over her sketchbook. So grumpy, Grace's laugh cut through his brooding silence, where she'd caught him hovering over the page, casting shadows in her mind. You would be too, he snapped, if you lost something important. So? Grace gave a relaxed shrug, indifferent to the eye roll she felt from 87. Stop telling yourself you can't find it. Dad always said the mind's a funny thing. Doesn't like to be wrong. It overlooks contradictions. 87's expression fell. What an idiot. Of course, it was so obvious now. They create their own blind spots. A scotoma, while Mobius couldn't be censored, the mind observing it could, and regularly blocked vast amounts of data to protect itself, preventing the mind from becoming overwhelmed or crashing. Since that day, 87 had been searching for and correcting his old scatamus, while doing all he could to foster those of his peers, particularly around the source code, making sure it remained obscure, maintaining his edge. Although he still hadn't found it, he had come to see in far greater detail the things in Mobius that his old scotomas obscured. It had led him to several important discoveries about their past, as well as Mobius and the creative force behind it. He simply referred to it as what is, this intelligent, omnipresent energy which seemed to saturate both physical and metaphysical realms. Over the years, despite his growing frustration at not finding the source code, these revelations had become more frequent. They proved invaluable, helping him stay several steps ahead of his peers. It annoyed him more than a little, however, that they stemmed from someone he considered so inferior. No matter his advantage, she seemed to hold the keys. And no matter how many times he revisited the past, no matter how infallible his memory, he could not see where in her mind Morgan had hidden the source code. Despite that, he knew Grace had been the very first sample, one so important that both Morgan and Velda King chose to hide her. Grace was the only one of them, the only sample afforded a normal life. His mouth soured at the fact, continuing to page through the files Hobbs had given him, enjoying the feel of them between his fingers. In Mobius, sights and smells were far more vivid and intense, the experience all-consuming. You experience things as an intrinsic part of them, simultaneously, all at once, and in their entirety. In that moment, connected to everything, textures, colors, temperatures, and scents. The place where past and present overlay, saturating beyond the sheath of time. It was inarguably more efficient, informative, and engaging. Yet outside of Mobius, confined to his physical form and one place in time, the singular experience held a deeply touching and sentimental charm of its own. Part of the monster group, connected but individual, able to experience the unique on a personal and subjective level, which was ironically the one thing Mobius could not facilitate. He couldn't deny that after years of exploring it and overwhelming his senses, he'd developed an affinity for the delicacy of the physical, of being confined to particles that filtered information and interaction into a uniquely personal experience. Closing his eyes, 87 reluctantly injected back into Mobius. From there, connected to everything once again, he scanned the document in an instant, could see every sentence, feel every meaning, grasp both concept and intent through its author. The files detailed sample capabilities, following years of what some might consider horrifically inhumane litmus tests. Submersion, air pressure changes, blood loss, trauma, and regeneration. Though now he and many of his peers had come to view them more as training. Training for a role no one had managed successfully and for which no empire survived. Their predecessors, too short-sighted and easily distracted, detached from real pain and suffering, yet consumed by it. The problem was, Hobbs was telling the truth. His version of it anyway. 87 could see he actually did want to find the source code to secure humanity's future, the version he deemed best. The problem was he didn't see samples as human and no longer felt the samples' golden handcuffs would suffice, given their growing abilities. He could see in Hobbs' mind he was searching for a backup, a kill switch to wipe them out. That's what he deemed to be in his own, and in humanity's, best interests. 87 had to hand it to him, despite the man's short-sightedness and lack of conscious access to Mobius. Hobbs was resourceful. He knew the source code would offer him that kill switch, and that 87 was his best shot at finding it. Moving his hand from the file, his thoughts drifted once again to Grace. Even though he hadn't found where it was in her, he could feel it changing him, bit by bit, after each interaction. His brow furrowed. There was one thing in these files that surprised him, however, or rather the lack of it. They showed no trace of Grace, no deleted files, nothing redacted. It suggested that right from the start, before the samples were born, Morrigan intended to hide it. But if not from samples, then who? Others at Inter. From his own interaction with her, 87 had found her abilities, although inhibited, mimicked samples. She was able to navigate Mobius instinctively, as opposed to those who accidentally opened doors using drugs or other various methods and washed through. Sipping at his coffee, their last chat surfaced, lightening his expression. Those bright green eyes shone up at him as though he were some sort of hero. Who didn't like that? Alex, however, had noticed the change in him. His mouth soured. That would mean the other samples would have. More concerning, other than 106, the others hadn't mentioned it, which meant they were now watching him closely. As far as he knew, they were completely unaware of Grace's significance, of the source code hidden in her. But should they find out, there was no telling how they'd react, how they'd want to use her. They were already heavily divided on how best to proceed with Hobbs and Inter. Her discovery would only introduce a new set of problems, potential eventualities he didn't care to entertain. But if there were one thing that united the samples, it was their shared sense of pride, durable and incredibly delicate, making them utterly predictable. His mouth twitched, recalling the moment Grace inadvertently brought about that unwelcome revelation. Nonetheless, it made it easy to dissuade any serious discussion that such a source code for samples existed. They feared looking foolish. Sweeping thoughts of Grace under the dull and mundane, hiding her between scotomas, his thoughts drifted back through Mobius to settle on Alex. She'd stood in a packed tent, calling out Silas the night of the fire. His smile grew, watching her chastise the giant who towered over her. But rebels had caused quite the stir at Inter, and 87 had watched Hobbs use every ounce of it to tighten security controls and increase his budget. For now, it seemed, they were playing into his hands, the obvious reason Hobbs allowed the rebels to continue. But 87 sighed. He had little doubt their time was drawing to an end, especially if they began to target food and O2 credits as Alex had suggested. That was Hobbs' main form of currency in the Third, both inflatable and untraceable. But tomorrow's itinerary popped up, slicing through thoughts in Mobius with what was likely to become yet another thorn in his side. Layden Canning, their new head of intelligence, would be arriving. With a scowl, 87 shut down the projection of the young man it portrayed. He'd tackle that problem tomorrow. The guy wouldn't last a week. But right now, there was something far more pressing. 106, 87 whispered through Mobius to where she lay, fighting to ignore him. Her mind raged. He came and went on his own terms, with whomever he wanted. Today proved as much. Her eyes rolled off their blonde examiner. No loyalty, no respect. That much was clear as she'd been, that they should rise up, that this was their time. But no, nobody listened to her, not when 87 was in the way. The samples had made their bed, with this philandering arsehole no less. A lazy, good-for-nothing, self-righteous. "You make it sound so personal," 87 drawled. "You make it personal. You know we should be in charge. Not those morons, mortals." 87 corrected, leaning back on their delicate threads in Mobius. "So let them dress up in immortality and paint grand illusions of power. You know it's just a security blanket, their life being but a breath. Why argue over something so quick to perish?" Her lip curled back. He was all talk and no spine after all. Philosophers forfeit life to talk about those who dare to live. She spat, her words fizzing out on the living tapestry where they float. Or do they live a life others forever talk about? Unmoved from where he rested, 87 winked at the salty expression that seemed to sharpen on 106. He could see she was in her kitchenette, her apartment on the floor above, banging pots and pans from where her thoughts wrestled with him and Mobius. This is our time, and you know it. We've studied them long enough, outperformed them on every metric. We should move now, overthrow them. Chapter 38. To outperform them, not entropy, or its tightening cycle, its noose around every empire. Excuses. Besides, 87's thoughts now lay with 106 in her lap. They're not going to kill the ones they hope to save them. 106 couldn't believe what he was saying, that 87 could be that naive. But then it seemed you could always be smart enough to be stupid, especially when it came to quantifying the abstract. He had seen the immutable pages in here, of life's living tapestry. Was he selectively recalling them? People regularly slaughtered those who were positioned to help, having labeled them a threat, or worse, vermin. Was he ignoring or simply overlooking that fact? Earth's thinning atmosphere is a far greater threat to them than we are, unless we change that. Yes, their golden cage was a cage, but it was filled with every creature comfort. Besides, he needed time with grace to access the source code. If history was anything to go by, they didn't need power for freedom. They needed the correct formula, one he felt sure he'd find in grace. Fighting now will only slow us down. You can't win a war until you know your enemy. I don't believe we've correctly identified it. They're right there, 106 snapped. Honestly, he was infuriating. You've experienced them torturing us firsthand for years. Just because your eyelids grew back doesn't change the fact. Open your eyes. God, he was impossible. Since when is the obvious enemy the enemy, and not some diversion, a distraction? If I didn't know any better, I'd say you're afraid, that you don't have the guts to see this through. You're a coward. Weak. It's pathetic. Time you were brave enough to open your eyes. Look at the monster we face. Are you brave enough to close yours? The only monsters more frightening than those you can see are those you cannot. The devouring shadow that lurks in a place no one can find you and no one can hear you scream. Where the victim inadvertently builds the invisible web on which they're strung and eaten alive. You've seen the parasites in Mobius and those they infect. He watched skeptical eyes bore into him. Experienced it firsthand. We all have. If certain groups of people were the problem, they would have been flushed out and lasting empire established. We know that's not it. It's something that transcends the material, the physical forms we inhabit, something that can cross generational lines. These parasites target irrespective of race, class, or creed. We are no exception. 106 watched 87's skin ripple as he allowed his own to surface, illustrating his point as they swam beneath his normally handsome face. All I see is you avoiding a necessary war. Her eyes narrowed. They don't make us weak, they make us strong, and we, unlike organics, can regenerate faster than these parasites consume. For now, but what happens when they mature? Think you can handle them then? We are them. You enjoy their appetite. You can't deny it. Not in here. 106 ripped away his usual facade, allowing the hiss and gnashing of teeth from his own parasitic form to lash out. Fleshy threads writhed and knotted together where they buried themselves in his muscular form. But to his surprise, her smug expression paled where she stood looking at him. They're making you weak! 106 jumped back for fear it might catch. You're losing your edge. Looking down, he noticed that there beside his rib, a few lay dead. Better yet, his flesh appeared to be healing. He pulled out the few dead parasites and continued to study the patch of flesh that had begun to grow back. It looked good. It felt good. It felt really, really good. But disgust soured 106's expression. You're no better than us. I see you. I know who you are. Who you really are. You'll never change, 87. Not really. Asterisk. Grace sat on her bed, decorating a montage she'd sketched out. with flowers of all kinds, wildlife, and even the odd dirt bird NFT tumbling through a porthole to escape the Pred invasion. Though she wasn't into gaming, Resnick was passionate about it, and in truth, she had to admit, dirt birds was fun. Not least because it seemed to unwittingly highlight the inverted paradox people seem to find themselves in. The bad guys, Pred, were derps spelt backward, made of the same stuff but aiming in the opposite direction. Mum had left the moldy sandwiches from this morning on the dining table as something of a statement, but head in the clouds, Grace found she was quickly lost in sketches, wrapped up in music. Her stomach's objection was for now dulled. By dinner, though, she was relieved to hear Resnick bounding up the stairs. "What you done this time, Trouble?" He ruffled her mop of loose curls and handed over a small box. "Was saving it for tomorrow, but figured you could do with cheering up." A smile tugged aside his mouth as he watched her tear through the wrapping. Dad would turn in an early grave if he saw that. Even before the troubles, during Christmas and birthdays, he'd float about the room, scooping up and ironing out their wrapping paper, folding it back up for reuse. "A gyroscope!" Grace gasped, holding up beautiful golden wheels that attached to several gimbals. She spun them round its single axis. "How? Did I know that's the kind of thing you'd like?" He shrugged. Wild guess. But his smile suggested otherwise. Grace could read between the lines. All he'd had to do was think of the most practical, academically themed gift, something he himself would consider desperately boring. "It's so beautiful." She watched as golden stone rings blurred to form colors she recognized from Mobius. "Knew you'd like it." Sympathetic eyes studied her tiny frame. "You must be starving. Dinner's on the table." But her expression fell. In her experience with Mum, things like this could go on for days. But as they pottered downstairs, her green eyes flicked up as there on the table, instead of moldy sandwiches as Mum had threatened, lay her lentil hot pot. Dad kissed the top of her head. "I'm working tomorrow, but it means you can open it now." He smiled through apologetic eyes, handing over a large box. "Happy birthday, my girl." Tearing it open, Grace gazed down at the microscope she'd been saving for. Her very own. A window into a whole new world that existed all around them, one almost completely invisible, but on which they depended very much. Its interaction discrete and significance profound in ways they would never fully grasp, it seemed. If it weren't for the fact she was so hungry, she'd have run upstairs to set it up. Instead, she slid the box to one side and plonked herself down at the table. Chapter 39. As they sat for dinner, Resnick happily relayed highlights from practice, his winning goal earning a tight smile from Mum. Dad had also had quite a day, it seemed, and hammered out details few of them understood. Grace knew enough to realize they'd come up with a viable option to fix Inter's energy storage problem on Halo. Mum, however, sat in menacing silence across the table from her. Realizing she'd been holding her breath, Grace quietly released it. She was being silly. This was a big step for Mum. Granted, it was no apology, but it was the closest Mum had ever come towards acknowledging that perhaps she'd overstepped. Usually she stuck to her guns, deflected or placed blame, rather than concede an inch from the position she had taken. If she said something cruel, it was because she was too honest and genuine, not like the other superficial people around her, and because she cared deeply enough to invalidate you. But here, although Mum hadn't actually apologized, Grace could see she was trying. "And what about your day, my dear?" Dad asked, gaze flicking between Grace and Mum, unable to ignore the tension. "What did you get up to?" "My performance went okay. Never known anyone play piano quite so beautifully." He smiled proudly. She was far from a great pianist, but Dad made her feel as though there were nothing she couldn't do if she tried. "The samples were at school. Seemed quite serious," she continued, watching his expression shudder. "I heard about that. Trouble in the third, I suppose, threatening to spill over again. I'm glad they're looking after you lot." Dad returned to Mum, eyeing her solemn expression. "What about this afternoon?" Grace stopped eating, caught between Mum's glare and Dad's concern. She'd seen how this scenario played out many times before. "I had a bath," she shrugged. "Worked on some sketches." The last thing she wanted was to see them argue again, but rummaging about on her plate, she uncovered several lumps, and dinner quickly tumbled out her mouth as a familiar, chalky scent dusted up the back of her nose. Inspecting her plate more closely, she found another and another. Mum was now glaring at her, and Dad put down his fork. "What's going on?" he insisted as Grace pushed her plate away. "Fussy," Mum snapped as Grace shook her head, Dad's gaze flicking impatiently between the two of them. "Is it in yours?" "I ate mine at lunch," Mum threw back at Grace with a shrug, continuing with her dinner. She eventually stopped under the weight of eyes watching. "Honestly, you're such a fuss pot," she glared at Grace. "There's nothing wrong with it. Strengthens your immune system." "It's moldy." "You gave her moldy food?" Dad exclaimed, inspecting his own more closely. "In God's name, why?" "Don't you dare," Mum shouted across the table. "The only time you speak to me is to take her side. I'm your wife, Michael. Her mother." "Then act like it." His words propelled Erin to her feet. Mum and Dad's argument rang out as Grace and Resnick retreat upstairs. Brushing past him, Grace dashed to the bathroom, only to be sick on the floor. Hugging the toilet, wave after wave washed out. In his attempt to help, Resnick threw a towel over the mess and began rubbing her shoulder. But it wasn't long until the bathroom began to fizz out of focus, and she sank into a long, fiber-optic tunnel that took shape, its gentle ring of silence absorbing the fizz that had carried her to the hammock of abyss. Lying there outside of time, she felt absolutely weightless, free of any discomfort. When she finally surfaced, Grace was back in her room, the knot in her stomach a painful reminder of what happened. But it was dark and beautifully quiet. For a moment she thought she saw 87 sitting beside her and wondered if she were perhaps still dreaming. But his usual callous disposition had been replaced by one of methodical care. "Ouch!" "Perhaps not." She shrank back, something sharp having pierced the tip of her finger. Placebo, 87, forced a wry smile, tucking away the syringe, sobriety having extinguished his usual satire. He'd broken just about every rule, well, the few he'd planned to keep. His jaw firmed, mulling over just how to cover his tracks back at Inter. He'd felt her tether through Mobius weaken, her lifeline flicker. It was just a flicker, though reliving it increased a sense of rising panic he didn't care to entertain. He hadn't thought. Up felt down and down felt up, and he, for perhaps the first time, had overreacted, had lost control, albeit briefly. Icy flames glimmered behind the dark look in his eyes. That enhancer shot wouldn't just help her physically. She'd become far more formidable, aware of herself and the value of what she held. He had to act now, had to distract her, direct her energy. He groaned. Effort, the sudden increase all but suffocating. Damn code. On a tide of growing resentment, he washed over her thoughts. There was an undeniable pattern emerging, and he froze, catching the tail end of them. Mug. "What?" he snapped, eyes narrowing suspiciously on where she lay. "I'm such a mug," she murmured. "Don't be ridiculous." 87 growled, realizing that as much as she was in his world, she was completely foreign to it. "Mugs are useful," he added with a smirk. Grace lay there soaking up his strength. It seemed as though through mere proximity. In your defense, she hadn't put on her black cape or hooked nose. Besides, who poisons a lentil hot pot? "So how on earth were you to know?" he drawled. "It's not like you had a lifetime of experience to go on." "Oh, wait. Your softer side in the wash?" she managed with a tired smile. "I don't have one." But stroking hair back from her face, he admired that freckled button nose. "Not even for you. You've no idea who you are." "Who I am." The words gushed out before he had a chance to think better of it. Or anyone else for that matter. Grace jest, easing into the blanket of sleep, mind washing towards Sirens of Odyssey. Although 87 knew she was referring to Erin, her words tugged at the guilty threads that hung between them. "I want to show you something," he offered, diving in after her, into Mobius, pulling her back from the surface of sleep. But she shook him off. She needed to be still, to rest, to not think for once, and just bathe in the weightlessness of Mobius. "So, multitask," he shrugged impatiently. "Shh." Gently wafting him away, she sank on rising tides. "Grace, if you're going to spin off on the elliptic curve, you might as well do it properly. I'm going to make you strong, so no one can hurt you." "Grace? Grace!" But from where she lay, she could no longer hear him, could no longer feel the exhaustion that had saturated. It felt as though some invisible satin sheet, A thin curtain pulled back, and she woke in a world outside of herself and time, to this familiar stranger. Annika woke in a cold room shroud in darkness, her head in a pool of light on the concrete floor. As she sat, someone yanked her to her feet. "I can stand," she bit out, eyes glittering with angry accusation from where she hung, shroud in darkness, surrounded by monsters.